But I'm searching for a great heart to stand me by underneath the African sky. A great heart to stand me by. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart to hold and keep me by. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart under African skies. Sometimes I feel that you really know me. Sometimes there's so much you can show me. There's a highway of stars across the heavens. There's a whispering song of the wind in the grass. There's a rolling thunder across the savannah. A hope and a dream at the edge of the sky. And your life is a story like the wind. Your life is a story like the wind. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart to hold and stand me by. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart under African skies. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. I see the fire in your eyes. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart that beats my name inside. Sometimes I feel that you really know me. Sometimes there's so much you can show me. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. Who comes in my side when you see you? I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. Who comes in my side when you see you? I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart to hold and stand me by. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart under African skies. I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. Who comes in my side when you see you? I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. Who comes in my side when you see you? I'm searching for the spirit of the great heart. Who comes in my side when you see you? I'm searching for the spirit of the great
I've been thinking about the way I think about my thinking. I have a feeling that our little boat is sinking. I don't know anymore what it is she sees in me. Maybe the promise of the man I used to be. Somewhere long ago we lost our way. Stop the clock and start again. If I could freeze the sun in the sky, I could go back in time. If I could only go back to that day, maybe we'll find our way. King of time. King of time. Hold the line. She'll be mine. We'll be fine.
Oh, so shallow and zombie.
She remembers things I said long ago. We're trapped in the past, the future won't flow. If If I could travel back in time, my heart would never break. Change the past and fix my mistake. We could wake up to a brand new day, whistling our troubles away. If I could speak to the king of time, he could erase and rewind. If I could only go back to that day, maybe we'll find our way. King of time. Ole mama ilanga awusashela le ntombi. Putting on my thinking cap, dreaming of my victory lap, looking for the mother load, hoping my head don't explode. My crazy ballerina loves the Zulu concertina, dancing through my memories. Man, you should have seen her. King of time. Impi wona nsimbieza ubani benga thinta mabubesi. Impi wona nsimbieza ubani benga thinta mabubesi. Impi wona nsimbieza ubani benga thinta mabubesi. All along the river, Chelmsford's army lay asleep, come to crush the children
For an ancient people who were only allowed access to the great Western universities comparatively recently, Jews have enthusiastically found a home in academia. In South Africa, as is so often the case, Jews are overrepresented at universities and institutions of higher education in proportion to the small percentage of the total population that is the community. Since South African Jews were among the first subscribers to what became the first university in South Africa, they have never really had to cope with closed institutions or restrictive quotas in the same way their co-religionists have elsewhere in the Western world. This is the Isaac and Jesse Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and Research at the University of Cape Town. Endowed in 1980, almost 40 years later, it's become the premier center for studies of South African Jewry and is the only research center of its kind on the continent of Africa. This is not to say that academic Jewish studies are but a recent phenomenon. You might say that the community in South Africa is hardly singular and is in fact the people of the books. Do you remember Fernão Martins, the intrepid converso translator who traveled with Vasco da Gama on his sea voyage to India? Left behind in Portugal was another crypto-Jew, one Abraham ben Samuel Zacuto, who was one of the most notable astronomers at the University of Salamanca in Spain prior to the expulsion of the Jews. He managed to utilize his expulsion to better his position by becoming Astronomer Royal to King John II of Portugal, where he was the mentor of Vasco da Gama and even designed special astrolabes and similar scientific equipment for his exploratory voyage to India, as well as providing astronomical tables. Even earlier, in Al-Andalus, Moorish Spain, Jews studied freely at the institutions of higher learning, where many rose in position and became highly respected teachers and instructors. It was in Europe that access to the universities and colleges was denied, and the reason is obvious. Most of these institutions had been founded or were under the control of the Catholic Church, often allied to specific religious orders, where the instruction given was to prepare the students for service within the church. But even if the Jews of England, France, and Ashkenaz had wanted to study, it was denied them because of their faith. Of course, enterprising scholars in the various Jewish communities always found a way of furthering their studies, but it was not until the emancipation that the doors of the halls of learning were truly opened for them. By the time the Jews began arriving in the Cape Colony, there were no restrictions at all on access to higher learning, since there were no institutions for them to study at. And so we get the initial South African College initiative, subscribed to by some of the members of that early Jewish presence in the Cape Colony. The development of institutions of higher learning in South Africa is a topic of its own, but in brief, restrictions on study were, for the most part, racially motivated rather than on religious grounds in accordance with the complexities of developing South African society. In the mid-19th century, a theological college for all the members of the Reformed churches was established, and that led later into a series of Afrikaans universities around the country that professed a Christian identity. It was the nationalist government's promulgation of the Extension of University Education Act in 1959 which firmly instituted racial segregation in higher learning and established ethnic university colleges for non-whites. The early Jewish immigrants to the Cape had a significant proportion of educated individuals amongst them, but it was the arrival of the Litvak wave of immigration that saw a university education being attainable for their children. Those who had lived within the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe had been denied by decree the chance to study at Russian universities, though a tiny percentage managed to find loopholes and even live in the great Russian cities. After the revolution, higher education was available to all deemed suitable, even women, as Russia attempted to industrialize swiftly to catch up with the rest of the Western world.
Though there were some educated professionals who arrived as part of this second wave of immigration into South Africa, the majority were laborers, tradesmen, some specialized craftsmen, and if they were enterprising enough and had a little capital to begin their ventures, businessmen. The reality that confronted many of the new arrivals is that no matter how willing they were to do basic manual labor, the existence of a much cheaper pool of workers from the indigenous population and the de facto institution of a color bar meant that the immigrants were forced to aim higher. The same aspirational drive that moved the Jewish population from Fordsburg to Sandton and District 6 to Constantia also propelled proud, if somewhat bewildered parents to attend graduation ceremonies where they could truly declaim, "Mein Sohn, the doctor."
It's worth noting that the first real expressions of academic study and research in the community came from the rabbis. The early community leaders were highly educated. Consider Reverend Alfred Bender, who ministered to the Cape Town Hebrew congregation from 1895 onwards, was Cambridge University educated at St. John's College, and he arrived in South Africa with an MA. The following year, in addition to his synagogue and community duties, he was appointed to the chair of Hebrew at the South African College and was also appointed to serve as the governor's personal representative on the Council of the University of the Cape of Good Hope. In his published collection, 2 volumes of his sermons, Bender could refer to or quote from Heinrich Heine and Maurice Maeterlinck, all for a Friday evening homily or drosche. Bender's predecessor was the Reverend Joel Rabinowitz, who had been a research worker in Oxford University's Bodleian Library. During his ministry in the Cape, he often contributed to the British Jewish press, whether accounts of the life of the community or appeals for assistance to ameliorate community needs. When he retired from his position at the synagogue, he studied a little further, moved to the gold fields of the Witwatersrand, and became a gold assayer and opened a laboratory. One of the most acclaimed thinker-writer rabbis of South Africa was Johannesburg Chief Rabbi Judah Landau. Born in Galicia, he was educated at the University of Vienna, which granted him a doctorate for his comparison between Hebrew philosopher Krochmal and Hegel. Landau reveled in the Western art, music, and literature he found in Vienna, and he contributed articles to various Judaic journals, wrote reviews, and also wrote a series of highly regarded dramas in Hebrew based on the lives of a range of Jewish heroes which are regarded as part of the developing canon of Hebrew drama. In addition, he was a poet and commentator on modern Hebrew literature, and all of this made him eminently suitable to hold the chair of Hebrew at the University of the Witwatersrand, in the same way as Rabbi Alfred Bender combined an academic career with his ministry in Cape Town. Landau, too, peppered his published sermons with quotes from the greats of the Western literary canon, and his remarkably comprehensive library of some 5,000 volumes of Jewish interest was bequeathed to Wits University as the Landau Collection. Other intellectual giants were Chief Rabbis J.H. Hertz and Louis Rabinowitz. Hertz went on to become Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom after serving the Johannesburg community, but during his time here, he managed famously to incense Paul Kruger and be expelled from the Transvaal Republic for his pro-British views. He was welcomed back to the Transvaal after the Anglo-Boer War by Milner, and whilst serving as rabbi to the Witwatersrand Hebrew congregation, he was also professor of philosophy at the Transvaal University College, which subsequently became the University of the Witwatersrand. Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz we already know as an outspoken critic of the policies of the nationalist government in South Africa. In addition to his spiritual duties as chief rabbi and head of the Beth Din in Johannesburg, Rabinowitz was also a noted historian and academic. He too was professor of Hebrew at Wits and published prolifically, everything from collections of his sermons to an analysis of the social life of Jews in northern France from the 12th to the 14th centuries. On retirement from his position as spiritual leader of the South African Jewry, he became deputy editor-in-chief of the monumental Encyclopedia Judaica. The two major universities in South Africa, Wits and UCT, both sustained a department of Hebrew or Hebrew studies almost from inception. Earlier I mentioned some universities or colleges that claimed a Christian identity. Each of them had a department of religious studies or biblical analysis or Semitic languages or even biblical translation where Hebrew was studied, but invariably this was classical Hebrew or biblical Hebrew and Aramaic. Stellenbosch University, UCT's great rival, had a course in the quaintly termed Ancient Studies, which sounds more descriptive of its faculty members than its subject. UNISA, the distance learning university, had courses in Hebrew literature, including contemporary poetry, as well as modern Hebrew prose of its time. But the opportunities for such specific study mirrored the growth and diminishment of the South African Jewish community. Today, less than a handful of biblical studies courses are offered here, and mostly in the departments of theology that survive, none of them staffed with Jews. UNISA has phased out its Hebrew courses, and the departments of Hebrew that produced notable scholars of the language and literature at Wits and UCT no longer exist. Jewish studies can be pursued at various yeshivot and religious centers, of course, and at the occasional adult education class, but on an internationally recognized academic level, the Kaplan Center in Cape Town is now unique on the continent. From the arrival of the Litvaks, though, a parallel stream of intellectual debate and creativity flowed for a good few decades. The lingua franca of the Pale of Settlement was Yiddish, the melding of Hebrew and medieval German that had initially evolved amongst the Jews known as Ashkenazi. Those who maintained this wellspring of creativity, which took many forms, newspapers, essays, debate, poetry, history, creative writing, and the like, were known as Yiddishists and brought the tradition with them to South Africa. In addition, they brought with them the often heated workers' politics that had found their expression in the Bund. I've mentioned before the Yiddische Arbeiters Club, which for a good few decades provided a range of activities for the Yiddish-speaking population of Johannesburg. There were other clubs, associations, and reading circles which promoted intellectual discourse. In Cape Town, Benkenstad's bookshop in District 6 was a hive of activity outside of its commercial function. There were readings, debates, discussion circles. In fact, Benkenstad functioned more like a university club than an ordinary bookseller. The number of books in Yiddish produced in South Africa is noteworthy, particularly when you consider the number of potential readers at the time. Interestingly, during the 20s, there were 2 printing works in Johannesburg, painstakingly hand-setting the commissions. But the process was so unreliable and uneconomical, some South African Yiddish writers chose to send their work back to Lithuania to be printed there.
Morris Hoffman and Hyman Polsky wrote short stories and sketches, as did Richard Feldman, who notably chronicled the relationship between the Jewish and black communities in his collection called Schwarz und Weiß. Joseph Sherman, who went on to teach Yiddish studies at Oxford University, wrote an autobiographical novel called Land von Gold und Sonnenschein, which was the first South African Yiddish novel.
The outpouring of poetry, in particular lyric poetry, was remarkably strong. Sarah Eisen in Cape Town wrote verses that expressed a woman's view of the South African experience. David Wolpe wrote poems and essays. Mendel Tabachnik wrote an epic 3-volume novel called Kalman Bullen, detailing the Jewish immigrant experience. The greatest of the South African Yiddish poets was probably David Fram.
Many of them wanted to acculturate as quickly as possible, which meant learning either English or Afrikaans. Those who were in the Platteland learned to speak to their workers there in a black language. Many of the literary focused immigrants in the beginning stuck to Yiddish, and Fram never wrote in English, ever. He was completely committed to Yiddish. That was his monument to his homeland, to his community, and he never wanted to change, and it actually prevented him from adapting easily. So he never really felt at home here. And even at the end of his life, he was still writing poetry about longing for home. So in the beginning, he writes a poem, Ich Bank, that he longs for his shtetl and the simple life that he left behind. And at the end, one of the last poems that he wrote was Oifa Dach, hop geschwitzet as Schwalb. Once on a roof, a swallow twittered. And he remembered the landscape of Lithuania in that poem. At the same time that he wrote Ich Bank, he also wrote in an Afrikaner Beginnen, in a South African dawn. And he describes the felt and the sounds that were different. The sun, it starts, Sizunik, it's sunny, couldn't believe it. And then goes on to describe the flora and the fauna, the hibiscus, the hydrangeas, the bright colors. Some of the poems are desperately sad, especially the ones that he wrote about the Holocaust, where he expresses the real loss of his family and that he wished almost that he'd been with them. And he imagines himself wearing the yellow badge and walking with them and walking with his parents to their fate. Lots of books that have come out now talk about Yiddish as a monument and a memorial, and that in Yiddish you can access the culture, not only the history, what they were like, what their lives were like before the war, not only to focus on the fact that they were destroyed, but what a rich community it was, intellectually, religiously, in the street, how they spoke to each other every day. And so it is a way to keep Jewish culture alive.
Jewish representation at universities across the country hadn't solely been associated with Jewish studies. Study at a tertiary level was part of the process of integration and stepping out of the shadow of immigration and bettering one's existence and that of the family too. Of course, the possibility of professional qualification was entirely dependent on family circumstances, and for a lengthy period, it was only the children of well-to-do Jewish families who could afford the costs.
There were bursaries within the community, as well as state support, but assistance for the talented who had no other means was limited to a very small percentage of those who needed it. In the first half of the 20th century, academic study was not the automatic route to be followed. With trade and commerce being dominant instead, many young Jews did not complete high school, having to join the workforce and help support the family. Since the 80s, though, the vast majority of Jewish matriculants have gone on to tertiary studies of some sort, even if the world of commerce was their ultimate destination.
What is it about Jews and medicine? On the one hand, there are endless variations of the jokes and stories about grandmothers ready to recount their litany of aches and pains at family gatherings, including suffering loudly in silence. On the other hand, Jewish involvement in the medical fields is a rich and lengthy history going back to Maimonides and earlier.
The Jewish contribution to the field of medical science, biology and physiology and physics in South Africa is more than noteworthy. No less than 3 Nobel Prize winners amongst them. This is not to denigrate the thousands of ordinary general practitioners that had many a mother quelling over their achievements and status, but let's consider a few of the internationally recognized men of science.
Solly Zuckerman was, unusually for the time, a second-generation South African, his grandparents on both sides having come to the Cape Colony from the Pale of Settlement. His high school education was at SACS, the South African College School, and he studied medicine at the University of Cape Town, becoming the very first recipient of a master's degree in anatomy awarded by UCT. After a stint at Yale University, he specialized at University College in London. Like Philip Tobias, he was an anatomist and worked at the London Zoological Society as a researcher. Later, he taught at Oxford and became a Fellow of the Royal Society. But it was during the Second World War that he entered the field for which he achieved his greatest fame. Because of his skills and his understanding of human anatomy, he was approached to serve as a researcher and advisor to the British government and the Royal Air Force.
Apart from designing a helmet for civilians, known as the Zuckerman helmet, he was the principal advisor to the armed forces on the effect of bombing. His advisory capacity didn't end with the end of the war, and he continued advising the British government on scientific matters right up until the 70s. He was an implacable supporter of nuclear disarmament and commented equally strongly on arms and the space race. He was knighted in 1956, promoted Knight Commander 8 years later, and appointed to the Order of Merit, and finally elevated to the peerage, styled Baron Zuckerman of Burnham Thorpe. Sir Aaron Klug was a classic example of the Litvak immigrant who made really good. Born in Zelvas in Lithuania, he came to South Africa as part of the last trickle of Litvaks with his parents in 1928. They settled in Durban, and Sir Aaron matriculated from Durban High School during the war years, moving on to study at Wits Medical School.
Realizing that his interests were not medicine but science, he switched to the fields of physics, chemistry and mathematics, later obtaining his master's in the University of Cape Town's physics department. For his doctoral studies, he relocated to Trinity College, Cambridge. Since South Africa was still part of the British Commonwealth then, it was easier for someone as brilliant as Klug to obtain a place and a fellowship at so prestigious an institution. He won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1982 for his development of three-dimensional electron microscopy while researching at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, and became a director of the laboratory 4 years later. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth and elected President of the Royal Society. Cementing his South African identity, he became a member of the Order of Mapungubwe, presented to him by President Thabo Mbeki. Sir Aaron also maintained a strong connection with Israeli universities, and Ben Gurion University in Beersheba named their Center for Structural Biology after him.
Philip Tobias was probably South Africa's favorite academic. Genial, amenable, acutely witty and intellectually brilliant, he had the gift of explaining even the most arcane details of his chosen field, paleoanthropology, in such an accessible way that everyone could understand. Like Aaron Klug, he was a banana boy, born and educated in Durban. He too was a product of Durban High School, and after matriculation enrolled to study medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand. As a student, he became deeply involved in student affairs and politics and was the first chairman of the National Union of Students, NUSAS. Whilst completing his honors in histology and physiology, Tobias realized that his interests were less in being a general practitioner and more research inclined, and that is when he shifted his focus. With Professor Raymond Dart as his mentor, Tobias began to study anatomy, genetics, and anthropology. It's the Taung skull. Further study abroad refined his focus, and he returned to this country to succeed his mentor as head of the Department of Anatomy and Human Biology. He worked with the Legacies at Olduvai Gorge in Kenya and continued his exploration of hominid remains at Sterkfontein Caves, and his reputation as one of the foremost paleoanthropologists in the world grew and grew. Subsequent appointments saw Philip become the Dean of Medicine and head of department, as well as the awarding of assorted professorships in a variety of fields. He published compulsively, lectured internationally, and taught his beloved students. All the while he railed against apartheid, countering eugenicists with sharply honed scientific responses, speaking out loudly and publicly against the government policies. A lecture he gave to the Union of Jewish Women in 1961 was entitled "The Meaning of Race," and so thoroughly demolished the ideologies of racism that it was subsequently published as an independent paper by the Institute of Race Relations. He was thrice nominated for a Nobel Prize and won so many other awards, he once ruefully joked that he no longer had space to display them, but would not think of moving from the Killarney apartment that was his personal sanctuary. When he died at the age of 86, among the many dignitaries who acted as pallbearers at his funeral at West Park Cemetery was former President Thabo Mbeki. The man was once described as South Africa's greatest scientific treasure, and the Yiddish word mensch was probably used more in his obituaries than for any other person. Like so many of his colleagues, Sidney Brenner was also the product of the middle period of Lithuanian immigration. His father was a cobbler working in Germiston, where Sidney was born in deprived circumstances, and legend has it he taught himself to read from the newspapers used to cover the table at mealtimes. He was educated at Germiston High School and immediately following, on receipt of a scholarship, at the University of the Witwatersrand. He began studying the practices of medicine, but was only 15 when he began the course. And though age was not a restrictive factor for tertiary education in South Africa of the time, being licensed to practice medicine was. The faculty realized he would be too young to qualify once he had completed his course, and he was steered instead towards a Bachelor of Science degree in Anatomy and Physiology. Sidney continued studying at the university and eventually received a doctorate from Exeter College, Oxford University. Later studies took him to Berkeley in California. Like Aaron Klug, he also worked at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, and during his time there, he was one of the first people to see Crick and Watson's theoretical model of the double helix structure of DNA. Though not a pioneer of molecular biology, Brenner advanced the field immeasurably, working all over the world. In San Diego, Okinawa, Singapore, who made him the first honorary citizen of that city-state, and other far-flung places, establishing laboratories and institutes. The recipient of multiple awards for his achievements, he became a Nobel laureate in 2002 for work in physiology or medicine, and the University of the Witwatersrand named their Institute for Molecular Bioscience the Sidney Brenner Institute in his honor.
In the field of surgery, the name Jack Penn stands out for the South African Jewish community, and not just because of the number of noses he reshaped. Penn became one of the most eminent reconstructive surgeons in the world. The title of his autobiography, The Right to Look Human, demonstrates the humanitarian principles that guided his work. Born in Cape Town, he relocated with his family to Johannesburg, was schooled at Parktown Boys High, and then enrolled at the Wits Medical School. He became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons after furthering his studies in Edinburgh. After working at hospitals in both the United Kingdom and the USA, he returned to South Africa and lectured in clinical anatomy at Wits. At the start of the Second World War, he was sent to London, applying his plastic and reconstructive surgery skills for war casualties, especially fighter pilots injured in the Battle of Britain. Returning home, he founded and commanded the Brenthurst Military Hospital, set up in the home of Rand Lord Ernest Oppenheimer, who had loaned it for the war effort. Oppenheimer then endowed a chair of plastic, maxillofacial and oral surgery at Wits, and Penn was the first professor. He subsequently held various other professorships and academic positions all over the world. Because of his expertise in military reconstructive surgery, Penn was a key figure in the medical unit that went to Israel from South Africa during the 1948 War of Independence, and he also achieved lasting recognition for his work in Japan, helping survivors of the atomic blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Tokyo firestorm. He worked extensively in Africa, particularly at Lamborghini at the invitation of Albert Schweitzer. Jack Penn had a creative side and won acclaim for his sculptures, particularly his busts of notable figures such as David Ben-Gurion. He also founded the first medical journal as a publishing forum for academic research on plastic surgery, and his clinic, named for the Brenthurst Military Hospital, still functions in Johannesburg. Percy Amoyles manages to straddle a couple of fields like Jack Penn. He too was born in Johannesburg, educated at Wits University, and went on to further his studies in the UK and the USA. Prior to entering medical school, though, Amoyles spent a brief period studying mechanical engineering,
before deciding to switch the focus of his studies. He never really lost his initial inclination and skills, which paid off handsomely in his multiple inventions for his chosen field of ophthalmology. Most notably, Amoils developed the cryoprobe used for the cryo-extraction of cataracts in 1965, and the technique is still in use today for cataract surgery. In addition, he developed the rotary epithelial scrubber. No, that's not a Jewish mother down on all fours cleaning her doorstep or her child's ears, but a special brush used for a keratectomy. Another of his inventions, which has become standard in the procedure, is his diamond vitrectomy cutter, the specialized scalpel used to incise the correcting lines in the operation. Given the Jewish involvement in the diamond industry and mining in South Africa, it's nice to know that the gemstones aren't merely decorative. Though Percy treated many, many patients throughout his long career, one stands out in particular: Nelson Mandela. Amoils was once called the man who made Mandela cry. No, he wasn't being villainous. Mandela's eyes and eyesights were affected by his years of hard labor in the limestone quarries of Robben Island, and Amoils operated on the great man's tear ducts. In addition, Selig Persik Amoils, to give him his full Jewish name, removed Mandela's cataracts using his cryoprobe. The word Torah is often translated as instruction or law, both legal terms. The word for justice, tzedek, appears 43 times in the Torah. An entire book in the Tanakh is called Shoftim, judges. Is this the reason the legal profession is second only to medicine as a source of pride for Jewish parents, however cliched the notion might be? In the many contributions of Jews to South African society, there's a prevalence of significant Jewish individuals in the legal field. Take, for example, Morris Kentridge and his son, Sidney. Morris, son of Wolf Kantrovich, was born in Utjan, a shtetl in the northeast of Lithuania, where his father was the Chazan. The surname Kantrovich actually means a son of a cantor, so it appears to have been a chosen occupation within the family for some time. In 1887, the family relocated to Britain, where Papa Wolf took a position as a shochet and chazan, and Morris began his studies first at the University of St Andrews and later at the University of Glasgow, where he studied law after a brief flirtation with medicine. I think I'm reiterating my earlier point here. The family moved again to Vryheid in South Africa, and at some stage anglicized their name to Kentridge. After serving his articles, Morris was admitted to the bar in Durban, and he was elected to the Natal Provincial Council as the Labour Party member for Greyville. Soon afterwards, he became a member of the Union Parliament, this time standing in Durban Central. Lured to Johannesburg, he famously represented both Fordsburg and Troyville at differing stages. And subsequent to that, he crossed the floor to Smuts's South African Party, and when the SAP became the United Party, he was one of the core figures of the more liberal wing. Throughout, Morris Kentridge was involved in the affairs of the Jewish community and the Board of Deputies, and was an ardent Zionist. His son Sidney was born in Johannesburg and schooled at King Edward VII School, Kes, before studying at the University of the Witwatersrand. He served as an intelligence officer in East Africa during the Second World War, going on to complete his studies at Exeter College, Oxford, after the war's end. Whilst establishing his reputation, Sidney took on a series of cases deemed to have political consequences. He represented Solly Sachs's garment workers, was part of the defense team in the treason trial assisting Izzy Maisels, and he appeared for the families at the inquiry into the Sharpeville massacre. Most notably,
He appeared for the family at the inquest into the death while in police custody of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko, where his incisive cross-questioning was so dazzling it was transmuted into a play and later a television drama where Albert Finney portrayed Kentridge. It must be noted that the two state doctors who attended to Biko after his police assault, Ivor Lang and Benjamin Tucker, were both Jewish. They were subsequently disgraced in the post-apartheid South Africa, but it is indicative that the community wasn't and isn't necessarily a cohesive unit. Kentridge's wife, Felicia, together with Arthur Chaskelson, co-founded the South African Legal Resources Centre, a non-profit organization in support of justice and human rights, and Sydney served as one of the trustees. He returned to practice at the English bar until his retirement in 2013, taking silk as Queen's Counsel and eventually settling in London, though he served as an acting justice of the South African Constitutional Court in the mid-90s. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth, and among his many other honours, the Sydney and Felicia Kentridge Award is given annually in their name by the South African Bar Council. Arthur Chaskelson graduated from Wits University and after serving his articles was admitted to the Johannesburg Bar in 1956. In 1963, he was part of the defence team in the Rivonia trial, the trial that ended with the sentencing of Nelson Mandela to imprisonment on Robben Island. Though he was a partner in a very successful legal practice, his commitment to human rights led him to establish the Legal Resources Centre together with Felicia Kentridge and Jeff Budlander, and he has served as the centre's director for 15 years. He was the first president of the South African Constitutional Court, and then, when the position received a new title, served as South Africa's first Chief Justice.
He was the recipient of many awards over the years, including the Justice Award from the Gruber Foundation at Yale and a Human Rights Award from the Jewish Board of Deputies. When he died in 2012, the South African flags over all national institutions were flown at half-mast in respect for his position as Chief Justice and his instrumental role in the development of the South African Constitution. Albie Sachs was born in Cape Town, the son of trade unionist Solly Sachs. In recounting his memories of growing up with his father, Sachs says he was the guy behind the newspaper. I saw the top of his head sticking out and his knees underneath. On graduation, Sachs became an advocate defending those who were charged under the apartheid laws. He was an attendee of the Kliptown Congress of the People, where the Freedom Charter was signed. Albie was repeatedly arrested and served with banning orders and spent 166 days in solitary confinement under the notorious Detention Without Trial Act for his political activism. On his release, he elected to go into exile, initially in the UK, where he completed his PhD at Sussex University. Later, he moved back to the African continent as a law professor and researcher in Maputo in Mozambique, where in 1988 a bomb was placed under his car by the South African security forces. Sachs lost his right arm and the sight in one eye. He began work with others, preparing a democratic constitution for the future new South Africa. In 1990, he returned home to serve on the Constitutional Committee in preparation for the country's transition to a constitutional democracy. He was appointed to the first Constitutional Court by President Nelson Mandela, where, in addition to his judicial duties, he was a key figure in the design of this Constitutional Court building in Johannesburg. In addition, he assembled the celebrated art collection that enhances the building.
Richard Goldstone is a third-generation South African with mixed English and Lithuanian ancestry. As a judge appointed to the Supreme Court bench, Goldstone brilliantly applied narrow definitions to subvert the apartheid laws, and he's credited with being more responsible than anyone else in bringing the Group Areas Act, the law that reserved residential occasions for whites only, to a complete standstill through his ruling on a specific case. After the 1994 transition of power, he was asked to be the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Though Mandela wished to appoint him to the new constitutional court, he was fully supportive of Goldstone as representative of newly democratic South Africa in international affairs. He was also appointed to the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and became its chief prosecutor, serving both tribunals with distinction. Further appointments to other international commissions and committees followed, but when he was appointed to the UN fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict, it proved to be extremely divisive within the South African Jewish community, even though Goldstone's objectives were, as he said, deep concern for victims in all sides in the Middle East.
Richard Goldstone retired from the Constitutional Court of South Africa in 2003. Other positions he held included the Chancellorship of Wits University and being a governor of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The multiple honors heaped upon him include the MacArthur Award.
I think what's characteristic about the way Jews have studied the law through the millennia is that it's been about debate and argument and questioning. And you see rabbis from different centuries disagreeing with each other about the same text. And that is encouraged. That tradition of looking at a law or a rule and interrogating it and being encouraged to formulate your view on it, a reasoned view on it, one finds in any regular Jewish household. One finds argument. There's something in not only the tradition of law and justice, which is very deep, but in the very way in which Jews explore it. If you combine the history of interrogating the law with an intellectual history, you begin to understand why so many Jews were prominent lawyers and are prominent lawyers in South African society. There were Jews like Solian Albie Sachs and Izzy Maisels and Arthur Chaskelson and many others who said, we can't let happen to other people what's happened to us. I think for them, that sense of injustice was perhaps personal. It's some explanation as to why one sees so many of the prominent constitution makers and human rights lawyers being Jewish. But we mustn't mistake that. It doesn't mean that most Jewish lawyers were human rights lawyers. Most Jewish lawyers were not human rights lawyers. But among human rights lawyers, there was a huge proportion of Jewish lawyers. There remains a handful of lawyers who have chosen to stay in South Africa and chosen to practice in our courts because they want to realize the Constitution. They want to make sure that South African society lives up to the promise of our Constitution.
From discussion groups, small focus societies and invitational salons of the early and middle 19th century to intense shiurim around worn tables in a shtetl somewhere in the Pale of Settlement, learning was always a significant part of the experience of the Jewish immigrants into South Africa. Once here, the tradition continued. In the larger centers, there were newspapers to be scanned, libraries to join, and if notable figures or experts happened to pass through Cape Town or visit the Highveld,
They could often be prevailed upon to give a talk or lecture to an attentive audience. It was one of the ways that the immigrants could integrate into the general community of South Africa, as well as learn the language and cross the gap to the established Anglo or Afrikaans society around them. Each wave of immigration brought a flowering of cultural societies. Many of the Landsmannschaften had special interest groups. If discreet anti-Semitism discouraged Jewish membership of some forms of adult education, why then the Jews would form their own. We've always been perceived to be an argumentative people. Talmudic reasoning, after all, is based on argument. And so long as these intense discussion groups didn't end in physical blows, where was the harm in such robust debate? Perhaps because women had a harder fight for education back in De Alterheim, many of the Jewish women's organizations had lectures as part of their programs. When the Union of Jewish Women was formed in 1931, its express objective was serving both the Jewish and broader communities, particularly in welfare activities. However, education, current affairs and self-improvement were also part of its mandate. Over the decades, its outreach activities have been laudatory. Rape survivors, HIV/AIDS education and support, equipping kindergartens and creches, skills training and empowerment, and many more related activities, as well as its welfare work within the Jewish community, ranging from kosher mobile meals to fundraising for an entire range of Jewish community projects. Almost from inception, its adult education section gained a reputation for engaging some of the most notable experts and eminent personalities to give regular lectures to the members. Today, the Great Park Synagogue supports a cultural center named for the late Chief Rabbi Cyril Harris. It has a vigorous educational program, its own art gallery, lecture series, film screenings, book fairs, performances, and classes that range from bridge to Yiddish, and is often the preferred location of book launches by noted South African Jewish writers.
Credit rating, which is tied for 7.
The International Jewish Education Festival Limud, which is the Hebrew word for learning, began in Britain in 1980. But it became a global phenomenon in a short space of time and is represented now in 80 countries.
It's certainly an incredible idea it's a marketplace of learning. It's a celebration of Jewish learning and culture. I think it's also a celebration of community. What's quite unique from a South African perspective is, of course, we do deal with issues which are pertinent to our community, in our context, in our society. But at the end of the day, we're also looking at the limuds across the world and bringing the best practices, the best presenters, the best sessions from there. So we have been very successful in getting a lot of those top presenters in the Limud circuit here, and I think it's one of the reasons why we've been so successful, and at the end of the day, not forgetting that we are in a South African context. When Limud looks at demographics, one has to take the following in mind. I often think that people think our community is exceptional. We are exceptional in many ways, but I would say that just as Limud has some challenges which are replicated across the community, those challenges are also universal challenges across the Jewish world. There is an incredible bouquet which people coming to Limud can choose from. This includes choice. I think choice is one of the reasons why we've been so successful. We're not going to be prescriptive. We know that the Jews in this community are interested in a whole range of topics. And that is one of the beauties of people who go to Limud, is not the actual sessions, which are wonderful, but the 15 to 20 minute gaps between sessions. When you walk out and bump into someone at the coffee station and they've gone to something which is totally different to what you'd ever go to, but you've heard it so good and you've made a note that you have to go to that presenter or that topic the next time round.
Of course, the Jewish Museum in Cape Town hosts lectures and conferences at which notable speakers present educative experiences for the community.
usually in tandem with the opening of its changing roster of exhibitions. Public lectures, seminars, conferences, and workshops are all part of the remit of the Kaplan Institute, as well as the publishing of volumes dedicated to specific aspects of the South African Jewish experience. 3 major libraries serve the Jewish and general community for study and education: the Jacob Gitlin Library in Cape Town and the Izzy Maisels Library in Johannesburg are open to the public, while the Jewish Studies Library is more academic, housed at the University of Cape Town and affiliated to the Kaplan Center. In addition, the South African Jewish Music Center collection is maintained at the Documentation Center for Music at Stellenbosch University. The Holocaust Museums of South Africa are located in the 3 major cities of the country: Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban. Cape Town was the first established, but in 2007, all 3 were linked by a unifying foundation. It's particularly pertinent that while each location has a permanent historical exhibition, given the particular history of South Africa, the vision has broadened to include not just the past and remembrance or memorialization, but an active engagement with the present and future. They are now known as Holocaust and Genocide Centers, dealing with racism, discrimination, prejudice, minority phobia, and their consequences in support of a human rights culture. The trigger was the inclusion of Holocaust studies into the South African general education curriculum, and the centers were expanded and developed to provide resources for the South African context. The education programs serve adults, educators, and learners and reach out to the entire African continent.
There wasn't this grand plan to launch a global project. It's just that the way the South African Jewish community embraced the Shabbos Project inspired the world. And so the remarkable story of the Shabbos Project is a story of the South African Jewish community, because we're a community known throughout the world for our unity and for our connection to our Jewish values and our Jewish heritage. And the Shabbos Project brought out both in such a powerful way, the sense of unity, that we all came together as brothers and sisters, as one community, irrespective of the differences in background and levels of observance and any of that. And we came together as one community, and also came together in celebration of our Jewish values, with Jewish pride, with Shabbat at the very center of that. And that inspired the world. The world was taken aback at the power and the resonance of the Shabbos Project in South Africa, and emails started pouring in. After that October experience in 2013, emails poured in from all over the globe where people said, we also want a Shabbos Project, can't you do something for us? And so within the first year, we had, I think, more than 400 cities involved, with partners working in more than 400 cities. And every year since then, it has grown to the point where in 2018, there were Shabbos Project partners working on the project in more than 1,500 cities and 100 countries around the world. 5,000 volunteer activists who were volunteering and making sure the project happened in their communities. More than 1 million participants in one form or another, reaching 5-6 million people on social media, on Facebook and the other platforms and social media, creating a global Jewish community and an army of partners and volunteers throughout the world who are so animated by the project.
The Shabbos Project is but one of the initiatives of South African Jewry that has gone global. If the Jewish neshama, or soul, is what links us all, it finds expression in many ways. How that soul expresses itself creatively is where we turn next.